The world has seen some shakeups in the last few months that will have far-reaching economic consequences well into the future. Big headline issues like tariffs been thrown back and forth, sovereign states been eyeballed for invasion, uncertainty over Eastern Europe, government administration, semiconductors and the US federal debt being called into question are the big, obvious issues making headlines. But even on top of that, there are smaller, less obvious dynamics like foreign aid, foreign investment and tech development that have all made the world, at the very least, a little bit less predictable. Now, call it a crisis, call it overdue, it doesn't matter to the BRICS because they are clearly seeing it as an opportunity. Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, which collectively make up the named BRICS members alongside Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Iran, Ethiopia and now Indonesia, which have also recently joined the club, which makes up the most compelling alternative to the US-centric global economy. Collectively, these countries control a huge share of the world's vital resources, almost half of its population, and a large share of global trade. By the numbers alone, it's hard to see why this group doesn't already have more influence. With so much internal capacity and a growing roster of members that have been shunned from existing networks, it's not inconceivable to see this group forming their own little self-sufficient geopolitical island outside of the control of traditional Western powers. Now, certainly that idea has a lot of people very excited, very concerned and very interested all at the same time, but to be fair, this ambition is nothing new. It's been the stated goal of this organisation since its establishment in 2009. Over that time, it's had some difficulties in actually achieving much besides an annual photo op for the world's political bad boys, but things are changing. The organisation is both growing and expanding its capabilities with renewed purpose, and perhaps more importantly, everything else is getting out of their way. So, what could a global economy with a fully established BRICS bloc actually look like? How likely is this to actually happen? And finally, what could stand in its way? Before we dive in, we want to give a huge thanks to today's sponsor, Storyblocks, a platform that has been instrumental in making our videos possible. Here's why. Let's say we need a quick shot of Shanghai skyline for this video. Instead of spending hours searching for the perfect clip, we simply type it into Storyblocks and boom, instant access to an extensive library of 4K and HD footage, music, templates and sound effects. What makes it great is the pricing. One flat rate gets you unlimited downloads with no unexpected fees or restrictions. Our editors swear by it because it gives them creative freedom. They can grab multiple clips, test different sequences, and refine the visuals without worrying about per-clip costs. And it's not just footage. Storyblocks also offers templates for After Effects, Premiere Pro, and DaVinci Resolve, making animations and effects way easier to pull off. It's a huge time saver, and frankly, we couldn't maintain our production quality and weekly upload schedule without it. Plus, everything is 100% royalty-free, so we never have to stress about copyright claims or licensing headaches. We've been using Storyblocks for years, long before they became a sponsor, and we can confidently say it's the most affordable way to get top-tier stock assets for video production. To get started with unlimited stock media downloads at one set price, head to storyblocks.com/economicsexplained or click the link in the description. Although BRICS has been technically active as BRICS since 2006, taking place on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly in New York, it held its first actual summit in Russia in 2009, which even then generally consisted of pretty hollow discussions about cooperation and financial issues after the GFC. Over the next 2 years, with the addition of South Africa, they formalised the BRICS acronym known today, only graduating from a symbolic gesture into an organisation with solidifying objectives in 2014, when they founded the New Development Bank, or NDB, as an alternative to organisations like the World Bank or the IMF. And while progress has been slow, it is growing with the formal addition of Egypt, Ethiopia and the UAE just last year. They were going to add Argentina into the mix as well, but somebody who apparently wasn't fond of communists took a chainsaw to that plan. Now, we've made a video about BRICS before, so we don't want to repeat too much of the foundational stuff here, but with the recent addition of Indonesia, along with a more comprehensive plan, things are starting to look a bit more concerning. Of course, concerning is a term used here because, for a majority of you watching, this growing collection are generally seen from our nations as the others, the rivals, the adversaries. So the idea of them forming their own group to challenge US dominance, as well as those that directly rely on it, is understandably a bit worrying. This is especially true as some of them are engaged in wars of aggression, are run by authoritarian leaders, and are committing human rights violations pretty openly. However, and despite these pretty reasonable concerns, independent nations wanting an alternative to a system that puts them under the thumb of the USA is not by itself evil. If anything, it's perfectly reasonable. If the USA, the UK, Australia and Canada all had to use some Chinese system to maintain normal operations, the fact of the matter is we would probably want an alternative too. Moreover, it's fair to say that even for historically and culturally aligned countries, the USA has become less predictable. So this has prompted BRICS to become more of a serious and attractive initiative, rather than what it has been for the last decade and a half, which is mostly just talk. If it all works out as planned, they will build a group of countries with their own currency outside of US dollar systems, where they could trade and conduct finance with one another completely independent of outside influence. Which could look something like a less intimately placed European Union. Regardless, the real question everyone has is if the BRICS can actually do what they've advertised, and the answer to that is probably not, at least not without a tremendous amount of sacrifice. All of their countries combined still can't comprehensively produce what the global economy can, but that could start to change if they corner the necessary resources from places like Russia, Brazil, the Middle East, and production mainly from China. And in all fairness, they are on their way to making some of this relatively feasible. For example, Brazil is now China's primary foreign food source, accounting for about 25% of all imports like soybeans and corn, weaning reliance off US agriculture, albeit very slowly. However, this developing symbiotic relationship is still a long way from reaching full independence from Western powers that BRICS promises to detach from in the coming years. Also, putting obvious political tensions aside for the moment, there is a cultural and institutional framework that something like the EU has that the BRICS hasn't accomplished, at least not yet. The EU has the European Commission, Parliament and Court of Justice, all of which together have the power to make, enforce and interpret EU law over member states. Plus there's the European Council, where heads of state meet to introduce policy that other members must follow. Meanwhile, BRICS, even with its new separate banking entity, which importantly must be recognised is not a central bank, still represents a loose association, lacking supernatural powers that can enforce the status quo. If BRICS really wants to become everything it's promised to be, it's going to need those strong institutions with credible authority over member states to keep the whole group in line. And that's a problem because none of these member states and their respective leaders are really going to be that excited about giving up their often unchecked power to some supranational body. Yes, there is a fair amount of decision making taking place at the BRICS summits, but none of these rules are binding. If one of the bigger players gives everyone else the diplomatic middle finger, there's almost no reality where the rest of BRICS at the moment could reprimand them for their decisions. It's true that Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, as well as new members, have immense potential as a collective, especially if typical Western-led partnerships deteriorate. However, they currently fail in a lot of ways when it comes to institutional cohesion seen in other organisations. For example, China and India are monoliths that work together to make electronics, machineries, textiles and more. The problem is, they really don't share the same views regarding the big picture. Putting the border disputes on the back burner, there are a lot of imbalances and general distrust between their economies, and India runs a crazy trade deficit with their northern partner. They also don't align that well when it comes to foreign investment. China's Belt and Road Initiative funneling money into Africa and Asia, as well as their Pakistani rivals, along with India's Asia Growth Corridor with Japan, clearly show a conflict of interest. Not to mention that India has refused offers to join the BRI, citing sovereignty and debt concerns. This keeps trade flows pretty lopsided and underdeveloped, and the not-so-silent rivalry between them has even hurt the new development bank as the two battle for influence over things like project allocations and regional dominance. If they wish to make a foreign aid financing system that matches or surpasses the World Bank or the IMF, let alone a compelling alternative to US-centric banking, they can't afford to have these divisive philosophies. Although, even all of this doesn't necessarily mean that BRICS is impossible. It would just require a lot of restructuring, and theoretically this is within reach, albeit with major changes in global commerce, starting with their administrative reliance on the West. In the past, and even to this day, global companies from Europe and the US have also been middlemen between these effective trade partnerships. For example, during the 20th century, firms like those in the US leveraged their control over maritime shipping and banking to act as brokers in international deals. European firms mediated Soviet oil exports in other regions, while US companies brokered commodities deals with South America. If they just dealt with themselves, which in fairness is a tall order, they could cut out that middleman. Moreover, the BRICS don't need to be insular. They can be like the EU and make trade easier between themselves, but still conduct it widely with the rest of the world, but retain the ability to be self-sufficient if they get sanctioned or tariffed. In other words, BRICS could be more like an insurance policy if, hypothetically, everything else falls apart, and given how the program has evolved over time, many suspect that this is the end goal. But that aside, all of this, at least in part, hinges on the likelihood no one gets in the way, and this is where it gets even more complicated. Whether these countries like it or not, BRICS is a delicate agreement at best. Beyond Russia, pretty much all of the other members still have extremely strong bilateral trade with other countries, and they simply cannot afford to lose. If they grow too fast, then world leaders will have to take notice, and there are a lot of things that countries like the US could do to weaken ties with more neutral parties. Take Brazil as an example. The US is already its second largest trading partner, and offering preferential treatment like broader access to markets could make it more attractive, as BRICS hasn't yet established anything like a general free trade agreement among members. Or they could do the inverse and carry the proverbial big stick. In the long run, Brazil might not have to be so dependent on US funding. However, currently, US foreign direct investment is a major lifeline for manufacturing, information telecommunications, real estate, financial services, and automotive sectors. This, along with China's reliance on food and India's balancing act, using both Eastern and Western military equipment, doesn't exactly ignite a sense of optimism in the BRICS. But then again, this threat is likely the dominant reason for the accelerated growth within BRICS after 2014. Even before the current trade war craziness, financial lockdowns of US dollar-based international banking systems demonstrated to the world that their US dollar reserves may only be as useful as their relationship with the US itself. And just recently, the current government has presented the possibility of 100% tariffs for BRICS nations that adopt a different default currency, along with counter-tariffs if any collaborating country considers retaliation. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that this will happen. In fact, it's more likely to be an aggressive, theatrical threat to get dissidents in line with the new status quo. However, that doesn't really sound any better. Imagine for a brief moment someone fresh out of school who just got hired to work a job at a massive company with a reputation for providing great benefits. But after a few weeks working there, the relationship with the employer and the board starts to change. Every month they get a new boss, some want to collaborate and talk about steps to promotions, and others tell them that if they see their job profile on any platform, they'll be fired on the spot without any kind of severance. On the surface, anyone might nod and agree as they need the income and benefits to stay stable, but there's no way in hell that someone dealing with this isn't looking for alternatives, even if that means taking a cut for the sake of security. If feelings like this persist and the US is seen as an unpredictable economic party, even typically Western-aligned countries will be silly not to at least consider the benefits of having some diversity in global influence. However, getting enough countries on board with the BRICS isn't really as simple as finding a safer option. As stated, getting the suicide squad of countries to actually coordinate has been hard in the past, and even though they're growing, that doesn't necessarily mean that they'll collaborate nearly as well as something like the EU. Take Egypt and Ethiopia, two African countries that joined the bloc in 2024. They share a common interest of an independent economic alliance, the possibility of a new currency, and having something to fall back on if Western relations sour. And yet, at the same time, Ethiopia's move to continue the construction of the Renaissance Dam upstream along the Nile has prompted the Egyptian government to send numerous threats, with consequences being literally explosive. And this doesn't stop with new members. Some of the founders have economic battles of their own. Despite the leadership of this group getting passed around year to year, China is the big dog that makes or breaks this whole thing, so the other members would need to be willing to give up a bit of autonomy to make this happen. To be fair, for Russia, this hasn't been much of a problem. Mounting sanctions and ongoing conflicts have made their decision to economically bond to China fairly easy. They also have complementary economies, with Russia relying on their partners' industry and banks for financial assistance and supplies, and China getting a return on this investment in the form of Russia's oil and natural gas, satisfying its boundless hunger for energy. It's honestly a match made in heaven for China too, as Russia is far more reliant on their support than the other way around. But the same can't be said for India. They've been making considerable strides in the global economy. However, India is basically 20 years behind China. They're still developing with close ties to the East and West, and the country's leadership has made it well known that they intend to close that gap with China in the realm of manufacturing. So while it's true that BRICS becomes more likely if more countries get involved based on their distaste for Western relationships, there are lots of countries with varying levels of motivations that actually all want something different out of the group. Stitching those interests together without compromising the intention of the group itself is going to be almost impossible. The best way to see this is to properly understand what each country realistically wants out of this loose alliance, and perhaps more importantly, what the BRICS alliance wants out of each of its members. Showing up to an annual meeting and taking photos shaking hands is pretty easy. Doing anything more is going to require some big moves from a hodgepodge group of authoritarian governments, democratically elected leaders from across the world, the political and wealth spectrum. These governments are also not completely unified entities themselves. They have their own internal politics. Now, this is Economics Explained, where like all economists, we pretend to be better than politics. But we've made another video breaking down these conflicting interests over on our other channel, Context Matters. You should be able to click to that on your screen now. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.